The male and female reproductive systems are immature and underdeveloped until puberty. So puberty is that time in human development where these sexual systems mature and males and females start to develop the secondary sex characteristics. So puberty is a time of great change in both males and females, and it is primarily due to hormones. Okay, so many of the hormones involved in puberty and the regulation of reproductive functions are the same in both males and females. So we're going to see FSH, LH, another hormone called GnRH. These are exactly the same in males and females, although they have kind of different functions in both. Now, the onset of puberty in both males and females is the result of both genetics and environmental conditions. So if you're a male and your dad hit puberty early, good chance you will as well. Environmental conditions do play a role, especially with female puberty. So diet, nutrition, that sort of thing. Exposure to certain hormone mimicking chemicals can also have an effect on when puberty happens. So I don't know if you guys remember years and years ago, if you bought a plastic water bottle, it would have something called BPA in it, and that stands for bisphenol A. And it was a chemical in a lot of plastics, still is, I guess, but it was found to have estrogen mimicking properties. So BPA was used in all sorts of things, water bottles being one of them, but the inside of like tin cans where food was stored, that sort of thing. And yeah, it's since been looked at more closely because it was interfering or thought to have been interfering with puberty. Okay. So puberty in males generally starts between the ages of 9 and 14. But again, you guys, this is a generalization. This is an average. This can happen earlier. This can happen later. But on average, somewhere between the ages of 9 and 14. So, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, even grade 10. But again, this can happen, outside of this age category. But regardless, when puberty does happen, the onset of puberty is because of the release of a hormone called GnRH from the hypothalamus. So what does GnRH do? It targets the pituitary gland. So it's a tropic hormone that targets another gland to release more hormones. And in this case, the pituitary releases FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. Now, the problem with remembering these hormones in males is that males don't have follicles in the same sense that females do, okay? And males don't have a corpus luteum, but yet these hormones are named after kind of what they do in females. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to remember what these hormones do in males because the names are misleading, right? They're named after kind of what's going on in females. So the way I remember it is follicle stimulating hormone has an S in it, okay? And FSH, its target is the Sertoli cells in the seminiferous tubules, okay? And what FSH does is it causes the production of sperm in those seminiferous tubules. So all of those things start with S. So for me, that's how I remember it, okay? FSH targets the Sertoli cells in the seminiferous tubules, which causes the onset of sperm production, okay? Now, LH is a little bit harder because there's not a kind of a mnemonic link there. But the interstitial cells are also called Leydig cells. That's another name for them. And LH starts with an L, Leydig with an L. But again, there's really two things going on in the testes, right? There's sperm production and there's testosterone production. So if we know FSH is involved in sperm production, then we just by default LH is involved in testosterone production. Okay? So LH targets the interstitial cells and it causes the interstitial cells to start producing testosterone. Now, testosterone is what's responsible for that cheesy little grade 7 mustache in my case, okay, maybe later for other people. It's the, the voice starts to crack, right? Because the vocal cords are starting to thicken and get larger. And, muscle development, broader shoulders, kind of the facial hair, like I mentioned. So these are all secondary sex characteristics, and they are tied to an increase in testosterone production, okay, which is caused by LH. Now, the male reproductive system evolved to produce hundreds of millions of sperm a day. That's it. It's one thing, make sperm. It's just meters of tubing, and that increases surface area for the production of hundreds of millions of sperm. Okay? Now, a male's hormone levels and sperm production remain relatively constant from the onset of puberty until at least middle age, okay, where we see testosterone levels drop. But sperm production can continue for the entirety of a man's life. I found a weird stat online when I was putting together this presentation. The world's oldest father is thought to have impregnated his wife at the age of 96 years old. So at 96, this guy was still able to produce sperm, and those sperm were viable and able to impregnate his wife. And we're seeing this in Hollywood. I don't know if you see sometimes, like Robert De Niro, an actor, was very popular when I was younger. I think he's well into his 70s. It might even be 80. He just had a kid. Like this is not unheard of, right? So and again, we'll see this is very different in females, but in males, a male's reproductive life can last as long as his actual life. Now, testosterone levels do decline, starting at around the age of 30 to 40. So from about the ages of 14, 15 years old, testosterone levels just spike, okay, and they will stay pretty steady until around 30-ish, when testosterone levels will start to taper off. By the time a male hits 50 years old, testosterone levels are less than half of what they were when he was 20 years old. Andropause doesn't have to be the end of a male's reproductive life, but it does signal a huge change in life. So things like loss of muscle, bone mass, this can lead to depression, weight gain. There's definitely an effect on a male's life when testosterone levels drop, but is not the end of the reproductive life, as we saw in the last slide, right? Now, North American girls typically reach puberty between the ages of 8 to 13 years old. Now, I put North American girls in there because this changes depending on the region of the world. And again, this is tied to diet, it's tied to nutrition, it's tied to exposure to certain estrogen mimicking chemicals. So this can cause puberty to occur a little bit earlier in North American girls. Now, just like in males, the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, which stimulates the pituitary gland to release FSH and LH. Okay, so up to this point, pretty much exactly the same as the males. GnRH is produced, causes FSH and LH to be produced by the pituitary. So at puberty, FSH levels increase and cause around 10 to 20 follicles to start to grow and mature each month after puberty. Okay, as the follicles grow larger, the follicles secrete more and more estrogen. So unlike males, basically when you turn the switch on in males, testosterone levels, they spike and they stay that way for a decade, okay, or more. But with females, the estrogen comes from the follicles. And the follicles start out at the beginning of the cycle as very immature and small. And by mid-cycle, they're very large. So estrogen levels actually increase throughout the menstrual cycle and then fall off and start again. So that hormone is actually fluctuates, unlike testosterone in males. Now, estrogen is responsible for the development of the female secondary sex characteristics. So remember, in females, the secondary sex characteristics are things like widening of the hips, breast development, body hair, etc. Okay, and with increases in estrogen, this is going to trigger the events of the monthly menstrual cycle. Now, the female reproductive system is responsible for gamete production and providing a place for the fertilized ovum to grow and develop. Right? So we talked about the uterus in a previous lesson, and we talked about how the uterus grows a temporary lining called the endometrium. And it's in the endometrium that the fertilized ovum, the zygote, the embryo, whatever you want to call it, it's going to implant itself and hopefully grow there for the next 9 months. Okay? But here's the thing. When the ovum is released, there's a 12 to 24 hour window after that release of that ovum for pregnancy to occur. But the place for the fertilized egg has to be ready for that pregnancy. So the female reproductive system has 2 jobs, but those jobs have to be coordinated. Okay? So the release of the ovum, which can result in pregnancy, there has to be a place for that fertilized ovum to go, which is the uterus, which has to have an endometrium. Okay? So all of these things have to be coordinated, and this coordination is achieved by changes in the female hormones throughout this 28-day monthly menstrual cycle. Okay? So really, the menstrual cycle is really 2 separate parallel cycles. One that's occurring in the ovary and one that's occurring in the uterus. We're going to look at this 28-day cycle, and we're going to look at what's going on concurrently in both of those places. Okay, so the following slides are going to tell us what's going on in the ovary and what's going on in the uterus. And you'll see that these 2 are coordinated. Okay, now a little disclaimer before I get going. I do not have ovaries. I do not have a uterus. I've never had a monthly cycle. So I am completely talking about this from what I've read in books. So again, this is completely secondhand knowledge. I've never experienced any of this stuff. So please bear with me. It's not my fault. Okay? The second asterisk that I want to put here is that what we're going to be talking about is a textbook example of the menstrual cycle. It is exactly 28 days long. Each phase is exactly, X amount of days long. And I completely realized that this is not what most females experience. Okay? Not only, from female to female, but a female from month to month. This can change all the time. It can change dependent on how much stress you're under. Stress can impact these hormone levels. So I just want you guys to understand, if you do not resemble what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. You're the normal one. This is kind of the abnormal thing, but we have to have benchmarks so that we can discuss this stuff. Okay, so we are going to go at it where this is every month is exactly the same. It's exactly 28 days. The stages last exactly, X amount of days. But keep in mind that if you're like, that's not the way things happen for me, that you're completely normal. Okay? And the last thing I want to say is, if you are at all concerned with anything that we talk about in this class, period, okay? If you're concerned, go see a doctor, okay? That's always good advice, that if something doesn't seem right, go see a doctor, okay? So we're going to break this 28-day cycle up into 2 main stages, the follicular stage and the luteal stage. Now, the follicular stage lasts from day 1 to day 14. So this is a cycle. We're going to end up back at day 1 again, okay? So we're going to start from day 1, And we're going to go through the entire 28 days. Okay, so we're breaking it up into 2 stages. Stage 1 we call the follicular stage. We need a starting point. So our starting point is the beginning of menstruation. This is the first day of menstrual bleeding. Okay, now what is menstrual bleeding? Remember we talked about the uterus and how the uterus grows a temporary lining because the uterus is made of smooth muscle, not the greatest place for a little embryo to implant itself and have a place to grow. So the uterus grows this temporary lining called the endometrium. It's very rich in blood vessels. Okay, it's very vascularized tissue, and it's a great place for the embryo to implant and start to get nourishment as it grows and develops. Okay, now if a woman does not get pregnant, each month this endometrium breaks down and is shed. Okay, and that's what we think of as a period, so to speak. Okay, we call this menstruation. You know, for our purposes, it's going to last 5 days. Okay, now why does this happen? It happens because hormone levels drop. So estrogen levels, another hormone called progesterone, which we'll talk a little bit more later, okay, LH, FSH, all of these levels at day 1 of the cycle are at their lowest. And because of this, this causes the endometrium to shed. Now, day 6 to day 13 of the follicular phase, what starts to happen here is that FSH levels start to rise. As we're going to see later, FSH is regulated by estrogen and progesterone. There's negative feedback loops. Because those 2 hormones are at such low levels during the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle, FSH levels start to recover in that first 5 days. They start to increase. Now again, FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So as FSH levels rise, what's happening? Follicles are being stimulated. Now, as the follicles start to grow, the growing follicles will start to produce estrogen. So by day 6 or so, the follicle is another follicle, a new follicle, right? We're on to another cycle here. So a new follicle is starting to grow, and as it grows larger and larger, the cells become more numerous in the follicle and they produce more and more estrogen. Okay, now what does estrogen do? Estrogen causes the endometrial lining of the uterus to grow and thicken. So the first 5 days of the cycle was getting rid of the endometrium. Okay, now that the endometrium is gone, it's time to prepare for the next month and a possibility of a pregnancy. So during the days, let's say 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way up to day 13, the endometrium is growing thicker and thicker and thicker because more and more and more estrogen is being produced by a growing follicle. So in the ovary, the follicle is being stimulated. It's getting bigger. In the uterus, the endometrium is starting to regrow and it's getting thicker and thicker over the course of days 6 to 13. Okay, what's happening hormone-wise? Estrogen levels rise because of the growing follicle. Now, estrogen has a negative feedback effect on FSH. So FSH levels drop. Now, you might think, well, okay, hold on, why? FSH levels just rose. Why all of a sudden have them drop again? Let's think about this logically, okay? FSH stimulated the growth of a follicle. The follicle has an ovum inside of it. That ovum is eventually going to get released and potentially has the potential to become a baby, right? Do you want another follicle growing 2 weeks after the first follicle has just been released with the potential of another baby being fertilized 2 weeks after the first baby being fertilized? No. Remember, the female reproductive system in humans is geared to growing how many babies at a time? 1. Okay? Although twins can occur, triplets can occur. We looked at a case where there were 8 babies in the uterus at one time, but multiple births is considered to be high risk. Okay? The human female reproductive system evolved to carry 1 baby at a time. So estrogen here has a negative feedback effect on FSH because you don't want another follicle growing at this time. One at a time, okay? Now, the other hormones that we are going to talk about, there's 4 hormones we're going to concentrate on here: estrogen, progesterone, LH, and FSH. So we need to worry about those 4 hormones, okay? So FSH rose. That caused a follicle to start to grow. Estrogen levels rose, which caused the endometrium to start to grow, but had a negative effect on FSH. Progesterone is also very, very low at this point, and LH levels are low at this point. Okay? Now, at or around day 14, the follicle is at its largest, and it has migrated to the fringe of the ovary. So the follicle kind of starts deep within the ovary, and through the course of the first 14 days, not only is it growing, but it's migrating toward the edge of the ovary. Okay, and at or around day 14, it will merge with the edge of the ovary, it will rupture, and it will release the ovum into the fallopian tube. Okay, so at this point in time, estrogen levels are very high. In fact, they are at their highest. High levels of estrogen cause a spike in LH. Okay, LH stands for luteinizing hormone. So estrogen does a few different things here. We have to keep this in mind. Okay, so what is estrogen doing so far? Estrogen is causing the secondary sex characteristics at puberty. Okay, estrogen is causing the endometrium to grow thicker. All right, estrogen is inhibiting FSH through negative feedback, and estrogen causes a spike in LH when it's at its highest. Okay, so lots to keep track of so far. Now, all of these things, high levels of estrogen, the spike in LH, this causes ovulation. Now, after ovulation, this brings us to the second stage of our menstrual cycle, which is called the luteal stage. And the luteal stage occurs right after ovulation, and it occurs from day 15 to day 28. So at or around day 14, ovulation occurs. Okay, so there's an ovum present at the top of the fallopian tube. Now, for about 24 hours or so, that ovum is viable, meaning it can be fertilized at this point. Now, at the same time, in the uterus, the endometrium is thick, okay, and it's almost ready in case there is fertilization. So again, the two places are coordinated, right? The release of the ovum and the endometrium being thick enough to be able to have that embryo, if pregnancy does occur, implant. Okay. Now, why do we call this the luteal phase? Well, because of that spike in LH. Remember, LH is called luteinizing hormone. And in females, what LH does is it causes the follicle, which was left behind in the ovary, right? The follicle stays behind. The ovum gets released, the follicle stays behind. And what LH does is it causes the cells of the follicle to turn into something called the corpus luteum. Now, I don't know if you remember from our last lesson, corpus luteum in Latin means yellow body. Okay, and that's what it looked like. I showed you a picture in the last lesson of what the corpus luteum looks like in the ovary. It's this big yellow mass. And what it does is it produces progesterone. Okay, so it goes from the follicle, which is producing estrogen, to the corpus luteum, which is now producing progesterone. Now, I think of progesterone as the pregnancy hormone. P for progesterone, P for pregnancy. So what is progesterone doing? It is going to continue to thicken and maintain the endometrium. So as long as progesterone's around, the endometrium is going to stick around. Okay? Progesterone also has a very strong negative feedback effect on FSH as well. So remember, again, if a female is going to get pregnant here, we do not want the release of another ovum. So progesterone has very strong negative feedback against FSH, and it causes the endometrium to continue to grow and thicken. Now, estrogen levels are going to fall at this point because there's no follicle. Now, the corpus luteum does secrete a little bit of estrogen. So it's not that estrogen is gone from the body, but it's kind of replaced with progesterone. Okay, so we see a spike in progesterone levels. LH levels, after the big spike in LH levels drop. Okay, and we're going to see that FSH continues to stay very low at this point. So this graph is very prevalent in any exams that I see on this stuff. I see this graph all the time. So please take a few minutes and label this graph in your notes. All right, let's go through this graph and kind of summarize the notes that we just took. So graphs are a great way to visually summarize information, and there's a lot going on in this particular graph, okay? So what we've done is we've divided the 28-day cycle into the two phases. So the first 14 days called the follicular phase, days 15 to 28 called the luteal phase. Now, right in the middle, this is right around day 14, we have ovulation, which is the release of an ovum from the follicle. Okay, so up at the top here we have follicular development. Remember, at the very beginning of the menstrual cycle, the follicle is very small and very immature. All right. You'll notice at day 0 here, day 1, that's kind of where we started. Notice that all 4 hormones at this point are at their lowest level. Okay, they're all at their lowest level here, all of the hormones. Now, what we see after the first day or so is we start to see FSH levels rise. Why are FSH levels rising here? Well, remember, estrogen and progesterone are the hormones that control FSH. And estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest levels right now. So because estrogen and progesterone are very low, that gives FSH a chance to rise. Now, what is FSH doing? It's follicle stimulating hormone. So what's it doing? It's stimulating the follicle. Notice the follicle is growing larger and larger, right? We have FSH levels go up. That causes the follicle to start to grow. But what is the follicle going to start to produce as it's getting bigger and bigger? Estrogen. And we see that as the follicle gets bigger, estrogen levels start to get higher and higher in the blood. Now, what does estrogen do to FSH? It inhibits it. And notice what happens to FSH levels. They drop. Okay, estrogen levels rise as the follicle gets bigger and bigger. And what is estrogen doing in the uterus? Causing the endometrium to grow thicker and thicker. Okay, so estrogen is negatively impacting FSH, positively impacting the growth of the endometrium. Notice as estrogen levels rise, the endometrium gets thicker and thicker. Okay, when the follicle is at its largest, the follicle here is at its largest, okay, we see that estrogen level is at its highest. That spike in estrogen causes a spike in LH. So high levels of estrogen, high levels of LH, what does that do? Causes ovulation. Okay? Now, high levels in LH are also going to cause the follicle to turn into the corpus luteum. Okay, so LH has now caused the follicle to turn into the corpus luteum. What happens to estrogen levels after ovulation? They drop dramatically because there's no more follicle to produce it. But what takes over for estrogen? Progesterone. What's producing the progesterone? The corpus luteum. Okay? Now, what does progesterone do? Causes the endometrium to get thicker and thicker, right? Because it's the pregnancy hormone. It's getting the uterus ready for a baby. When would the baby have been made? Right after ovulation. Okay, so the body is getting ready for that fertilized ovum. So after ovulation, one of two things can happen. Either the ovum gets fertilized or it doesn't. What happens if the ovum gets fertilized? So within 12 to 24 hours, if sperm are present in the upper part of the fallopian tube, then the ovum can become fertilized. The fertilized ovum is called a zygote. So over the next few days after fertilization, the zygote will start to divide through mitosis, and one cell will turn into two, and two into four, et cetera, until we have a few hundred cells in this little ball of cells called an early embryo, okay? Now, that little early embryo, it's going to start to produce a hormone all on its own called HCG. HCG stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, the chorion, as we'll see later on when we talk about embryonic and fetal development, it's a layer of cells in the early embryo, and it's a gonadotropin. So it's going to have an effect on other hormones. Okay, it's going to cause the continued release of progesterone. So what HCG does is it maintains the corpus luteum. As we're going to see here in a bit, if there is no pregnancy, there is no HCG, the corpus luteum breaks down, progesterone levels fall, endometrium is shed, that's it. Okay? So it's up to the embryo itself to maintain the corpus luteum. As long as the corpus luteum's around, then there's an endometrium. As long as there's an endometrium, there's a place for that embryo to implant itself. If the embryo did not produce HCG, then the corpus luteum would shrivel up and die, progesterone levels would drop, endometrium would go away, and there would be no place for implantation. There's no pregnancy, okay? So it's actually the embryo itself that is maintaining that corpus luteum, which maintains progesterone, which maintains a place for implantation. Okay? And that's why I have a picture of a pregnancy test up here, because what a pregnancy test does is it measures HCG in the urine. Now, there's barely a measurable amount of HCG in a female's blood if she's not pregnant, like barely at all. But once this little embryo starts to produce HCG, there's so much of it in the blood that it actually ends up in the urine. And that's how these pregnancy tests work. Okay, there's enough of this HCG in the urine to actually be picked up chemically by these tests. Now, once you have determined, yeah, I might be pregnant, then you would go to a doctor and you would get a blood test, and a blood test would decisively conclude, yeah, I have lots of HCG in my blood. You know, that's the result of being pregnant. Now, high levels of progesterone inhibit FSH secretions, and this is going to prevent the development of another ovum. Okay, progesterone is also important in maintaining and thickening the endometrium. This is going to give the embryo a place to implant, and that embryo is going to develop in that endometrium. That endometrium is actually going to become something called the placenta. Okay, later on, and it's going to get its nourishment, and it's going to exchange nutrients and waste products through that placenta for the next, hopefully, 9 months. All right, so if there's fertilization, corpus luteum sticks around, progesterone sticks around, endometrium sticks around, and you're pregnant. So if there's no fertilization, there's no HCG, and the corpus luteum begins to shrink and break down. Now, because there is no corpus luteum, that means that there's no progesterone, and what happens is the endometrium will start to break down. Okay, now if the endometrium starts to break down, that means that we are starting to get toward the end of our 28-day cycle. And because it's a cycle, where we started, right, is kind of where we end is where we start, right? So as the endometrium starts to break down because of a lack of progesterone and estrogen, we are now back to the beginning of the cycle, back to day 1, which was the flow phase, right? That's menstruation. Now, because all the hormone levels are at their lowest, that allows FSH to start to recover, and we get another follicle developing, and we get another cycle the next month. So we come back to this graph again. Now this graph, if you look at it, does it show a woman who's pregnant or a woman who did not get pregnant? That's easy to determine because we look at the progesterone level. If this progesterone level were to have risen and taper off like this, if the progesterone level would have continued like that, then we know that the corpus luteum would have stuck around, and the only way the corpus luteum is going to stick around is if there's HCG, and the only way there's HCG is if there's an embryo, right? So if we don't see progesterone levels drop, then that means there is a pregnancy. Okay, because the progesterone levels in this case are going to drop down dramatically, obviously the corpus luteum is not sticking around, and there is no pregnancy. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. A female is born with all the follicles and ovum she will ever have. So at birth, it's estimated between 5-6 million follicles in a little baby girl's ovaries. By the time that little baby girl hits puberty, there's only maybe 400,000 or 500,000 left. That's it. Every month, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 follicles start to develop, and generally only one will actually make it to maturity. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, what this means is eventually a female will run out of follicles. Okay, unlike a male, a healthy male will make sperm all the time, every day till the day that he dies if he's healthy. Okay, a female there's a finite amount of follicles, and eventually the female will run out of follicles. And when a female runs out of follicles, that means that estrogen levels and progesterone levels basically disappear. Okay, menstrual cycle becomes very irregular and eventually stops altogether, because remember, the onset of the menstrual cycle is because of estrogen, right? And because of the follicle secreting it. No follicle, no estrogen, no menstrual cycle. So eventually a woman reaches a point where her reproductive life is done. There's no more follicles, there's no more ovum, and she cannot get pregnant. This is called menopause. Okay, low levels of hormones can cause symptoms like increased risk of heart attack and stroke, decreased bone density, hot flashes, increased cancer risks, and mood changes. Now, years ago, many doctors prescribed something called HRT. HRT stands for hormone replacement therapy. And what hormone replacement therapy essentially was a supplement of estrogen and or progesterone. Okay, and this helped to alleviate a lot of those symptoms. Now, the problem with HRT, years later, it was determined by Health Canada and the US branch of the FDA. They found that HRT actually elevated the risk of dementia, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers. So today it's not recommended for most women. Okay, so you have some homework in your note package. Please take a look at it.